Well, this is not just a welcome to everybody in this room, but my expression of a deep admiration for the degree of heroism that is sort of in evidence at the moment. It's a welcome on behalf of the Forschungsstelle Globale Prozesse, and in particular it's not just a warm welcome, but a tropical welcome to our most distinguished guest today, a true highlight, let me say the highlight of the current summer semester. Professor John Darwin will be with us for 3 days, discussing his ongoing work with us and taking part in conversations about mutual interest. This afternoon, as you see, he will give a lecture on Unlocking the World, Port Cities and Globalization, 1830 to 1930. So it's about key cities in a way. I like the metaphor of sort of a locked world, and let's see what's going to happen to it after 1830. Elsewhere in the world, it would be a cliche. We would probably use the cliche saying that Professor Darwin needs no introduction. Indeed, he's one of the most famous British historians worldwide. In Germany, he's been a household name for decades now among people dealing with imperialism and the British Empire. His wider fame, however, is closely related to the publication of the German translation of his great book on empires, Der imperiale Traum. I'm not terribly happy, I must say, with the German title. So this is the original after Tamerlane. The rise and fall, they left out the rise and fall, and they left out Tamerlane. So I think the original is preferable. It dates from 2007, and shortly afterwards, the book was awarded, the author actually, the Wolfson History Prize, the most prestigious British award for history writing for the general public. A second book by John Darwin has been translated more recently, and this is this one. Das unvollendete Weltreich, the original is Unfinished Empire, so no complaint about this title. Aufstieg und Niedergang des britischen Empire, which actually should be read in conjunction with a companion volume called The Empire Project, The Rise and Fall of the British World System. I think we shall discuss that today, or at least certainly tomorrow, what is an empire, what is a global empire, and what is a world system. Now, among his earlier books, let me single out there are many of them, two of my personal favorites. One is I think, earliest monograph, Britain, Egypt, and the Middle East, Imperial Policy in the Aftermath of War. And then, now watch the title illustration. This one, which I think is still, though published in 1988, unsurpassed as an analysis of British decolonization, again with the Sphinx gazing at us. Now, John Darwin has been a fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, since 1984. He is a professor of global and imperial history in the University of Oxford and concurrently a director of the Oxford Centre of Global History. We have the privilege here at Konstanz to be affiliated with the centre in a network that in turn that studies historical networks, a network about networks. And this means, since we have this sort of developing and emerging cooperation, this means that Professor Darwin's visit, in a sense, is a networking expedition by itself. But the main purpose is, of course, to acquaint us with the work he is currently engaged in. We are very grateful, John, that you've accepted our invitation. We hope that you will be enjoying your stay, and the lecture is certainly going to be a milestone event in the history of global history at Konstanz. Please join me in welcoming John Darwin.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm welcome. Now, I've chosen the title Unlocking the World partly really to refer to a much more famous phrase used by one of the leading British naval strategists of the period before 1914, Admiral Fisher. And Admiral Fisher said that British naval and world power depended upon what he called 5 keys that lock up the world. And he was referring, of course, to British control over Singapore, guarding the route between East Asia and the Indian Ocean, control, of course, also over the route around the southern part of India through a British base in what's now Sri Lanka, British control of the Cape of Good Hope, the British effective control over the Suez Canal by having occupied Egypt since 1882, control over the Mediterranean through naval bases at Malta and Gibraltar, control over the North Atlantic through the British base at Halifax, Nova Scotia, in what is now eastern Canada. And although we're now far beyond the 5, also, of course, not to be forgotten, the British base in the Falkland Islands, the very southern tip of South America. So in thinking about places that, for Admiral Fisher, locked up the world, it seemed interesting to think about some of the places that helped to unlock the world in terms of opening the world up, not just to European influence, but it's very important not just to see it as exposing the world to European influence, but opening up the world to a greater degree or a higher degree of connectedness, connectivity, and integration in the period, particularly of the 19th century up to 1930. Now, in this process, what I'm arguing in this talk is that port cities played an extraordinarily important role. They, after all, were a striking feature of world history, you might say, for at least 3,000 years. One thinks back to the cities of Tyre, of Carthage, and Sidon. Often it seems that Europe's own history revolves around these port cities and their fate. Think again of Carthage, Constantinople, Naples, Venice, Genoa, Barcelona, Lisbon, Seville, Cadiz, Amsterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, Bremen, Lübeck, Danzig, Bergen. I could go on and on. Not to mention London, Liverpool, and Glasgow. Or indeed, for that matter, great inland port cities, because not all port cities have to be on the ocean, like Vienna or perhaps even Munich. These port cities in Europe reflected the fact, but also helped to make the fact, that Europe, especially Northern Europe, had become the most densely connected part of the world and the most commercially dynamic part of the world by the beginning of my period in 1830. That's to say, on the eve of the great globalization of the long 19th century. Now, if we use that talismanic word globalization, we need, I think, to have a little bit of definition. And of course, the simplest way to think about it, and I'm sure here you have thought of far more complex ways of thinking about it, the simplest way, of course, to think about it is to note that globalization implies connectedness and integration. But we should also remember that that connectedness, and this is the key problem of understanding global history in my view, is that that connectedness is always uneven. There are always some parts of the world which are better connected than others, and it's hard to imagine, even in the most highly connected world of some time in the future, that there won't be places which are less well connected than others. Simple facts of life dictate that. Now today, but no doubt not here, where your historical perspective is long, today most of us in the world are mesmerized by 2 things. One, the belief that our own globalization since 1990 has been the only real one. And that secondly, that globalization is essentially a financial and commercial process, phenomenon. Now, I think both those notions can, of course, be challenged and should be challenged. It's much more realistic to think of our globalization of today as one of a series of globalizations. And one could easily think of more than three, but perhaps three will do to start with. We might think of there having been a long pre-modern globalization of Eurasia. And notice I'm using globalization in relation to Eurasia rather than the whole of the world, because it is, I think, a powerful argument that globalization cannot always be understood usefully if one insists that every single part of the world is connected up simultaneously. That's part of the idea, I should say, of that network, at least the Oxford end of the network, to which Professor Osterhammel referred, that there are variants of globalization, and globalization does not have to be at all times thought of as connecting every part of the world. So a long pre-modern globalization of Eurasia, perhaps going back to the extension of Hellenic influence towards India, Rome's connections with South Asia, Chinese expansion, the Mongol expansion that created a Pax Mongolica and permitted transcontinental trade across Eurasia, and of course, not to be forgotten, the great, you might say, sub-globalization or semi-globalization of Islam, spreading eventually, of course, from Morocco on the far west of Africa to Southeast Asia. Secondly, there was what we might call, and I'm going to call, early Colombian globalization, from 1492 up to 1830, characterized by the great exchange of commodities from now the Americas as far away as China, principally, of course, famously, the exchange of silver from South America for the goods, especially the luxury goods and commodities, and manufactured imports brought back from China. But we have to remember, nevertheless, that even that extraordinary process of globalization that set in after 1500 was subject to very important limits and exclusions. Geographically, of course, much of the world's interiors were actually very little connected up to the oceans or to global commerce. Much of the interior of Africa lay beyond the knowledge and certainly beyond the commercial reach of either Europeans or, for that matter, Chinese or South Asian merchants. Technologically speaking, this was a globalization still, of course, dependent upon the vagaries of wind and current, imposing extraordinary, you might say, elongated route connections between Europe and other parts of the world, and dependent also upon animal power. Demographically, this globalization was characterized by a limited outflow of Europeans, a limited outflow of Chinese, especially to Southeast Asia, and a very, very, very limited outflow of South Asians up before 1830 from their part of the world, usually into parts of Central Asia and Southeast Asia. In terms of communications and knowledge exchange, you might say, here again, although there was significant exchange and contact, the volume and velocity of that contact was relatively low. And in terms certainly of trade, the great economic historian Jan de Vries has pointed out that in the 18th century, you could have put all the goods that came back in a year from Asia to Europe on a single container ship of today. In other words, the scale and volume of that commercial connection was still pretty modest. Now, my period of globalization for this talk is what you might call the late Colombian globalization from 1830 up to 1930. You might ask why I want to call it late Colombian. And of course, that term I take in a way from the great British geographer, and indeed some people regard him as the inventor of geopolitics, Halford Mackinder, who talked about the Colombian epoch, which he saw coming to an end around 1900 with the rise of what he imagined to be the powerful threat of the great heartland-based empires of the continental interior of Eurasia. In reality, nevertheless, despite Mackinder's imaginings, this was a world that was still very largely, predominantly sea-based, right through that period from 1830 to 1930. Indeed, the outcome of the First World War demonstrated how vital it was to be able to deploy sea routes and sea connections to mobilize resources and manpower in the greatest struggle the world had seen to that date. The second great feature of this late Colombian globalization from 1830 to 1940 is, of course, what historians have come to call, since about 2000, the Great Divergence. That's to say, the apparently ever-increasing gap that grew between the wealth and productivity, especially of northern and northwestern Europe on the one hand, and its offshoots in North America, the United States, and other offshoots around the world in the South Pacific or in bits of South America, on the one hand, and apparently the ever relatively declining performance of large parts of Asia upon the other, especially, of course, the decline relative and perhaps even absolute of China in this period. So a great and widening divergence in technical power, economic power, wealth, scientific ability, the capacity to project, especially military power. The third feature of this late Colombian globalization was, of course, the extent to which a colonial world order, characterized not just by the imposition of colonial rule, but by the extension of what you might call informal empire, empires of influence and predominance, even without necessarily the flag at the flagpole or the imposition of foreign rulers on the ground. A colonial world order becomes not quite universal, but certainly extremely widespread. And we should also remember that that colonial world order was also characterized by the persistence of slavery. Slavery in North America and the United States until 1863 or 1865 in reality, persistence in South America, in Brazil and in Cuba until the 1880s, and of course persistence, much less well documented, in parts of Africa and parts of Asia as well. And lastly, this period, this epoch of globalization, was characterized in a way which was not characteristic of the previous period, up to 1830, by what my colleague James Beddich very usefully calls mass transfer. The mass transfer of people, of course, through demographic movements, the vast migrations out of Europe, but also out of China and out of India. The mass transfer of technology to large parts of the world beyond Europe. The mass transfer now in terms of volume of goods, even of foodstuffs. The mass transfer of beliefs, especially through the proselytization of Christianity. And for that matter, also a recurrence from something which had been absent in the 18th century, the mass transfer of diseases. All these transfers occurring mainly, but not only, to and from Europe and its possessions. Now, we might like to think, though I won't dwell on it now, upon the comparison and contrast in those four characteristics between that globalization and what we think of as being our current experience. Lastly, perhaps, just notice that my insistence on 1830 to 1930. What I want to do is to highlight perhaps three things. Firstly, that this period saw a fundamental continuity of the world order into the 1930s. I say that despite the great upheaval and disruption of the First World War. Because if you look beyond Europe, which of course is significantly disrupted after 1918 from the old empires, you find a much greater continuity in terms of the capacity still of Europe-centered powers to control or influence large areas of the world, either directly through colonies or indirectly. Secondly, this is still, might say, a period of remarkable technological continuity, in which the two key technologies are dominant: steam on the one hand and print on the other. The United States is beginning to be a major exception to the extension of automobile traffic, the car. But for much of the world, steam power and print, you might say, dominate the ways in which people communicate. And finally, I've picked those dates because it's important, I think, not to see globalization as a smooth, exponential increase of connectedness and integration, but as a process massively subject to breakdowns, reversals, crises, and collapse. There's no reason to suppose, and after all, we've learnt this much ourselves since 2008, there's no reason to imagine that globalization is a smooth path. Well, now let's turn properly to port cities. Port cities play, I would argue, a crucial role in the global processes between 1830 and 1930. I want to try and explain that role, but also hint at some of the limitations that were imposed upon it. Now, I'm not concerned here with the great port cities of Europe, not even London, despite its enormous growth and importance. By 1820, more than 10% of the population, or nearly 10% of the population of the United Kingdom was concentrated in London. I'm really concerned with what you might call the springboards and bridgeheads in the rest of the world, through which European influence primarily, but not solely, as I'll go on to suggest, is exerted upon large parts of Asia and indeed the Americas and Africa. There is, of course, a huge choice of port cities to select from. Here's just a very short list. New York, New Orleans, Montreal, San Francisco, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Freetown, Lagos, Cape Town, Durban, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Istanbul, Alexandria, Beirut, Izmir, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, Rangoon, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tianjin, Nagasaki, Yokohama, Melbourne, Sydney, Auckland, Wellington. Well, could go on. So I've selected 3 out of that, and you may well want to challenge me in discussion and say, well, you've picked 3 which prove your points. You could have chosen any number from the list I've just read out, or indeed added to them from many more. Incidentally, perhaps the great fiction writer who captures something of the essence of the nature of these port cities, in English, I hasten to say, would be Joseph Conrad. Those of you who read his great novel Nostromo will recognize the little city, it's only a small port city of Sulaco, which captures a lot of the, you might say, characteristics of such a port city. Of course, his depiction of Singapore in many of his novels set in the East Indies, in the East Indonesian archipelago. Now, my sample, for my arguments, is taken from 3 cities: New Orleans, to represent the Americas, Izmir, to represent the Near East, the Levant, and Singapore. Now, what characterizes one or more of these port cities? These are places, above all, where the movement of goods, of people, of information, and ideas must, so to speak, change gear, because they encounter, in some sense, a gateway or doorway through which they have to pass into a terrain which is less easily crossed or penetrated, less familiar, where there is going to have to be a search for new intermediaries, new messengers, perhaps even new processes of communication to carry, whether it's goods or people or ideas, deeper into this hinterland, this interior. That is what essentially characterizes a port city. But of course, what makes them usually located in the places they are is that here is where deep water or a deep water port is available from which goods can be transported onto land-based or river-based alternative systems of transport. But secondly, these port cities serve also as regional hubs as well as the termini for long-distance travel and communication. They link up regional worlds as well as worlds that are far distant in terms of the geography of the globe. Thirdly, they function, of course, primarily as places of exchange, usually, of course, for staple products, that's to say, raw materials produced for a world market, like cotton or sugar or cacao or even silk, perhaps, or tea. Think of any one of or tin or rubber. Think of any one of the great staple products with which Europe is increasingly, constructing its industrial economy by drawing upon the plantations and other sorts of production elsewhere in the world. And for that purpose, of course, these port cities have to provide as an absolutely essential basis for their exchange function, warehouses, places of safe storage. So all these port cities would have had great areas devoted to the storing of the products brought from the interior. Thirdly, of course, they become great centers inevitably of finance and also of insurance. Finance because much of this product from the interior has to be produced on systems of credit by the offer of seasonal credit by bankers or moneylenders in the port city to the rural producers in the hinterlands. Inevitably also, they become the place where local compradors, or banyans in India, operate in connection with European merchants who may not understand or even have the linguistic capacity to understand the intricate commercial transactions of that interior. Think of the compradors, of course, above all in China. Fifthly, these are places where it's vitally important also to process and grade the products that come from that interior, whether it's cotton or whether it's opium. The opium produced in the Ganges Valley is auctioned in Calcutta in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s before being made up into chests that are then sent on to its great market in China. Port cities also provide crews, gangs of workers, especially maritime workers, for the ships and for also the harbour work. Anybody who's seen a photograph of a harbour before our modern era, when now there are empty places with a few cranes, will have remembered seeing in those pictures enormous scores and scores of men carrying everything, like ants, you might say, on their back. Every ship had to be unloaded by dozens, if not more, wharf workers, dock workers, lugging loads on their back from the ship to the warehouse. So this is a huge process of mobilizing the labor needed for the greatly increased traffic of ships and the hugely increased business of carrying goods manually from ship to shore. Seventhly, it's a place, of course, for the exchange, the gathering, and the distribution of information, commercial information especially, but also, very often, political information, information about political risk, as we would call it today. So port cities are invariably characterized by the early emergence of newspapers and the later coming of news agencies connected up by wire, and of course the rise of that very useful institution, the Chamber of Commerce, where merchants particularly can exchange information, collect commercial intelligence. Eighthly, only two more after this, eighthly, these are also usually places where you find a great increase in the volume and in the activity around both philanthropy on the one hand and education on the other. This is partly because, being regional magnets, these cities attract a wide variety of different merchant groups. They create new fortunes, and in a way they construct new communities. And the leaders, the elite, you might say, amongst these communities are invariably anxious that those communities should be bonded together, saved from moral decay by philanthropic enterprise, and increasingly also by the provision of at least some forms of education. Ninthly, they are also the scene of what you might call processes of religious mobilization, partly because different religions tend to meet in these new communities, these new commercial communities of the port cities, and the religious leaders of these different communities are again anxious to consolidate their influence, preserve their flock from contamination through education, through schools, and also through encouraging a wider knowledge of the religion. This might take the form, perhaps, indeed, of using print technology. And of course, many port cities, especially in Asia, become also the scene for people gathering to go, especially if they're Muslim, on pilgrimage to Mecca. But finally, we should notice again that what port cities were particularly striking for was the disparate, the very different populations and communities that they collected together. and for the fact that usually the merchant elite is drawn from people who are not native to the locality. That's even true in New Orleans, where most of the leading merchants came not from the South, but from New England or New York. They were Yankees set loose in the South. Now, all these features were reinforced in the 19th century by a number of other hub-creating developments. The rise, especially, of scheduled steamship services, which arrive in Asia in the second half of the 19th century, well, really pretty much after about 1870. The Peninsula Orient Company, P&O, were early on the scene, really from the 1840s. This is really something which develops after the opening of the Suez Canal. They're also, you might say, reinforced by the arrival of telegraph and cable links, again in Asia. This is largely from the 1870s onwards. And then by railway building, which gives the port city an enormous extension of its hinterland. You've seen those maps that show you, for example, the railways spreading out from Buenos Aires in Argentina, like a fan, connecting up all the different zones producing the grain, the maize, or the meat, which is going to be shipped out through Buenos Aires to Europe. Coaling stations, the rise of coal as an essential fuel for global communication, again means that those cities which are able to attract large quantities of coal, be sure of providing coal for any ship that might arise, are also going to have an advantage over those that fail to compete successfully as the central key coaling stations of the world. And lastly, there's also the challenge that all these port cities faced of continually improving or maintaining their sea communications. Almost all of them face the challenge of the environment. In Calcutta, for example, there is constant anxiety that the Hooghly River, the Hooghly estuary, is going to silt up and chase shipping away to some other rival port. Or there's the need, as ships become bigger, to create the kind of harbour that's going to be an efficient means of unloading and loading ever larger ships. And all these costs, indeed, raise also political difficulty because somebody has to bear them. The unsuccessful port cities are those whose politics do not allow them actually to mobilize the cash and the political support needed for it to maintain their position at the front of the race to be a major port city in the world. Now, what influence might we expect these port cities to have on globalization as we understand it, connectedness and integration? We might be inclined to see them as great beacons of cosmopolitanism, tolerance, openness, willingness to tolerate peoples of different language, different culture, and different religion. We might secondly see them as great beacons of liberalism, because after all, their whole lives depended upon free trade, the core value, you might say, or certainly of British liberalism. Their lives depended also upon free movement of people in and out. And because they tended to collect together different communities, were inherently multi-ethnic, you might say they also might have been expected to encourage the free expression of ideas between or across different communities to allow for, or to at least to provide for, their multicultural, multi-ethnic character. Thirdly, we might expect them to act as agents of social modernization. Here, after all, they are commercial societies in which the capacity to do well commercially was the key to success, rather than perhaps necessarily your degree of faith or your religious connections or affiliations. So we might expect them to be at the forefront of promoting both secular and also class-based societies. And lastly, we might expect them to have acted, in some respects anyway, as the catalysts of state building, being on the receiving end of European influences, especially the idea of the nation and of nationalism, and also being perhaps best placed to peer out across the world at the Westphalian state model, which had become, you might say, naturalized back in Europe. In fact, however, the impact of port cities on all these fronts, we might conclude, was surprisingly limited. Now, looking at our three, let's try and see why. First of all, New Orleans. Now, New Orleans' position, of course, as everybody would know, arose from its extraordinary geographical advantage of lying at the bottom of the great Mississippi Valley. And from the 1830s onwards, of course, once American settlement had reached the Mississippi and transformed particularly its southern regions of the Mississippi Valley into a vast cotton-producing zone, you might say New Orleans' fortune was assured. In reality, of course, in many ways, it had come into existence as a result of a series of geopolitical accidents. It was originally, of course, a French colonial city, which passed to Spain, then back to France, and if Napoleon had had his way, it would have been the headquarters for a great Franco-American empire, French-American empire, in the early 19th century. But again, as perhaps we all know, Napoleon's failure to capture Haiti, the loss of his army sent to Haiti to regain this incredibly valuable sugar colony, completely alienated him, disillusioned him about the prospects of an American empire. And he then sold off the vast claim that France had into the American interior for almost a song to the Americans in 1803. But New Orleans, soon as the lower Mississippi Valley became the great cotton kingdom, and think of the numbers. In 1791, the United States of America produced 2 million pounds of cotton. By 1860, it produced 1.5 billion pounds, an increase of some 700 times, 60% of the world's cotton production. And much of this pours out of New Orleans from the 1810s and 20s onwards. And indeed, in the 1830s, New Orleans briefly overtook New York as the greatest export port in the United States. Partly as a result, New Orleans becomes a magnet for immigrants, merchants, the mercantile elite, as I had mentioned, who came from New York and New England, but also, of course, for other immigrants from different parts of the world. Far from looking out on a world in the interior of the Mississippi Valley, which is sometimes presented, especially for those who spent too much time watching the film Gone with the Wind, as being a feudal aristocracy rooted in an almost, you might say, timeless setting of happy slaves. The interior of the southern United States was characterized by exceptional mobility. Very few of those who set up cotton plantations stayed on them for more than a few years, if the latest research at hand is to be believed. This was a world of ferocious, of feverish commercial activity in which people moved in, and white people moved in, borrowed the money to acquire some land, borrowed more money to buy some slaves, and then struggled to produce as many cotton bales as they could in order then to borrow more money, to buy more slaves, and probably then to move on after exhausting the land that they had used up into some new zone where they could hope to get a bonanza crop. This is a world of feverish commercial activity characterized by constant reliance upon credit, highly speculative activity, whether in land buying and land selling, in betting on the cotton crop, all, of course, dependent upon the success of the cotton crop in any one year. Now, it's no surprise, in fact, that in 1860, the merchants of New Orleans, given where they came from, and given, of course, the prospect of what war or secession might bring them, opposed secession. But what influence did New Orleans really exert over its vast Mississippi hinterland? Three factors, I think, have to be borne in mind to explain why, perhaps, it was very limited. New Orleans had to become, as part of its commercial dynamism, the largest slave market in the United States. It was indeed the epicenter of the second slavery, the slavery dedicated to staple crop production, the slavery which you might say really came in the 1780s. New Orleans looked south to Cuba and Brazil, or at least some people in New Orleans did. as slave economies in tune with that of the American South. What we have here, then, is a notion of modernity which saw slavery, astonishingly to our ears, as an essential component of creating a modern society and a modern economy. This was, argued typically the intellectuals of New Orleans, the only means, slavery, whereby the subtropics of the world, and they included also in this much of South America, the only means whereby they could be developed, and they said, the only means whereby black people, Africans, could be civilized. Not only this, of course, but the whole socio-political culture of the lower Mississippi Valley had not derived from the influence exerted inland by New Orleans, but had come overland from Virginia and South Carolina, because most of the population which moved into the Deep South had indeed moved down from those exhausted states, where their soils increasingly, particularly Virginia, had become exhausted, into the bonanza lands of the American Southwest. And this socio-political culture built upon a racial democracy, upon slavery, and upon Protestantism, seemed justified by its extraordinary economic success. The great American economic historian Fogel argued, or worked out, calculated, that had the Confederate States of the United States become an independent nation in 1861, they would have been the third or fourth richest nation in the world. Finally, of course, you might say that the geopolitical crisis of the American Civil War really put an end to New Orleans' hopes or claims of being a great port city with any real control over the hinterland of the Mississippi. In 1862, it's captured by Union forces, and from that moment on, you might say, it's declined to becoming really more, of course, still a significant commercial center, but more a place of picturesque social and cultural survivals. Its decline into that kind of city was more or less assured. In other words, New Orleans was not the shaper of its hinterland, but the product of it. My second example is Izmir, Smyrna, as it was called in the 19th century. Now here you might think was a classic bridgehead of the West into the Islamic East, going back to the era of the Silk Route, into the era of the early modern Levant Company, the rise of French influence based in Marseille. Its real takeoff, though, comes in the 1830s, when, in the great crisis of the Ottoman Empire, it's forced to agree, in the Treaty of Balta-Liman, to throw open its internal trade to outsiders without restrictions. From that moment on, Smyrna, as a great port, becomes the great entry point for Western commerce into Asia Minor. Smyrna is at the junction of four worlds that were in very uneasy equilibrium. The world of the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman rule and reform and very gradual liberalization from the 1840s. A Mediterranean world dominated really by Britain, France, and Russia. One thinks by the later 19th century of the extent to which the British controlled Egypt, the French were placed in Lebanon, and the Russians asserted protective power over much of the Christian population of the Ottoman Empire. It was also at the center or the junction of a Greek world, an expanding Greek world, since the foundation of the Greek state in 1830, which produced also a significant amount of immigration into Asia Minor and to Smyrna, because Smyrna is such a rapidly growing and dynamic commercial center. Indeed, to many Greeks in the Kingdom of Greece, it looked a far better prospect for a career and for prosperity than remaining in their own rather small, but we shouldn't make any contemporary parallels, rather beleaguered state for much of that later 19th century. But finally, and perhaps rather threateningly, Smyrna is also at the junction of what we should think of as the steppe world, the world of the steppes, because Anatolia is part of that steppe world. And it's a world which, by the later 19th century, sees ever-increasing demographic turbulence, not least because of the advance of Russia into the Caucasus, and indeed because of the breakdown of Ottoman rule in parts of the Balkans, both of which produce major migrations of Muslims into Anatolia, who have to be resettled somewhere. And often they are rather disorderly populations because the conditions in which they have been uprooted have themselves contributed to a sense of anomie and disorganization. So far from being a secure Western bridgehead, actually Smyrna is a precarious cosmopolis. It depends really upon two things. First of all, the continuation of an Ottoman regime which allows for the peaceful coexistence of its Christian, Greek, and other populations, including the Levantine elite, largely drawn from France and Britain, and to some extent from Italy, on the one hand, and its Muslim population upon the other. By the early 20th century, geopolitical factors have threatened that cosmopolitan possibility with complete breakdown. As the Ottoman decline grew steeper and it lost more and more territory in Europe, the volume of refugees into the zones around Smyrna grew and grew, causing ever-increasing disorder in its immediate locality. And then, from 1914 onwards, a vast crisis enveloped the whole of this Near Eastern world, from Macedonia to the borders of Iran. And in the course of that, as we know, by the end of the First World War, the attempt by the Greek kingdom to carry out the great idea, the Megali idea, of bringing Ionia, Anatolian section of what it saw as being the Greek diaspora, into a unified Greece, prompts, of course, the response from Ataturk and Turkish nationalism, which led to the destruction of Smyrna as a city altogether, and certainly the expulsion of its Greek population. Finally, and I'll be brief because time is going on, and you're getting hotter, and so am I. Singapore. Singapore, you might say, represents the success story which the others don't. Unlike, but only by chance. Unlike Smyrna, of course, it was a crown colony protected by a great power, a very great power, Britain. Like Smyrna, it had gained from the opening up of a nearby continent, China indeed, after 1842, or under Siam after 1850, and of the Netherlands East Indies after 1870. And then, of course, as a result of the great revolutions, of the opening of the Suez Canal and the arrival of steam, Singapore becomes the great port that links East Asia and Southeast Asia to Europe. It also becomes a great immigration entrepot. By 1899, 200,000 people are arriving every year, almost all from China, but some from South Asia. It too, like Smyrna, is the junction of multiple worlds. A British world, which provided it with naval protection, with governance and law, with a regime of a free port, crucial to its commercial survival, with some elements of its mercantile elite and connections to, of course, the great credit world of the City of London, and which also gave it, after 1870, access to the area of Peninsula Malaya, which the British have intervened in and come effectively to dominate. But it's also part of or connected to a Malay world, which after 1900 is becoming increasingly self-consciously Islamic. It's connected to India through the immigration of Tamils, especially from South Asia. It's connected to southern Arabia. Hadramis from Hadramaut, that's near Aden, filled up whole streets of Singapore, according to contemporary descriptions of the late 19th century. But above all, it's a Chinese, part of a Chinese world. Ever since perhaps the 12th century had brought Chinese into the southern Nanyang, the southern world. But by the 19th century, that migration, as we've seen, had become on a very large scale indeed. And here were Chinese who adopted, in many respects, the values and principles that they saw emanating from their liberal rulers. Those called the Straits Chinese or the King's Chinese sought to insert their loyalty to the British Empire and also, perhaps rather strikingly, their desire to take modernity of a British style into China proper itself. One of the most striking features of the late 19th century, early 20th century is the extent to which wealthy Singapore Chinese imagined a future in which certainly southern China at least might be turned into a zone of British style or at least British influenced modernity as a result of the combination of British power and wealth and Chinese wealth and influence. But like Smyrna, Singapore experienced a life-threatening crisis soon after the end of my period in 1930. It survived, you might say, but by the skin of its teeth. It survived because it was able to escape from the conquest of Japan, and indeed from breakdown after the reconquest in 1945, through its usefulness to Britain and the United States as a great naval base, and also as a front line against the expansion of communism in the Cold War. But its ideological separation from China was only secured, you might say, by the violence of the emergency period in Malaya after 1948. Now, what conclusions might we draw from these examples and from my larger sketch about late Colombian globalization? If we think of the great liberal promise of 19th century globalization, perhaps most famously embodied in the ideas of Richard Cobden, the great British free trader, it promised peace, interdependence, and the pervasive influence of the diffusion of liberal values, above all, of representative government and the rule of law. In reality, that 19th century globalization had to be promoted in a world dominated geopolitically by empires, both European and also, as we've seen, indigenous empires, Ottoman and Chinese, but one in which also nationalism was a significant and growing counterforce. It was also a world which was neither genuinely open and transnational, nor, on the other hand, neatly partitioned between empires capable of policing their borders efficiently. This meant there were wide zones of uncertainty and competition, as in the Near East or in East Asia. It's also a world made disorderly, if not by intra-European wars, then by multiple conflicts outside that main European theatre, whether in North America in the 1860s, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, inside China, and this is also disturbed by mass migrations, not unrelated to these great conflictual events. Think how many Chinese left China as a consequence of the huge disruption of the Taiping Rebellion of the mid-19th century. So the port city pursued its course towards a cosmopolitan liberal modernity in a highly stressful environment. Thus, Smyrna's uniquely plural society, tolerated by the Ottoman Empire, financed by foreign capital, energized by Greek immigration, protected by the European concert, could not survive demographic, cultural, political, and economic consequences that arose from the massive crisis of the period after 1914. Singapore was more fortunate, because arguably it was much less cosmopolitan. There was no national state, like Turkey, to conquer it, although Indonesia might have tried, and it survived the great crisis, as we've seen, of 1942 to 45. So a final conclusion might be that in these three cases, and we could extend the list perhaps to Bombay, Calcutta, Shanghai, Hong Kong, where the liberalizing and globalizing forces of the port city struggled against the very different characteristics and trends of interior politics exacerbated by economic misfortune after 1914, that port city influence was bound to be very limited. And then, secondly, in these three cases, and perhaps many more, it was ultimately the nature of the geopolitical regime that, if anything, determined their fate and success. In our age of globalization, you might say, geopolitics still remains the king of the castle. Thank you very much.